The child's shoe lay in the rubble, small and pink with cartoon characters I couldn't name, one strap torn but the other still fastened, as if waiting for its owner to return. I stood there in the dust and heat of Gaza, my hands shaking despite 20 years of training that taught me never to shake, and I understood that everything I thought I knew about duty and honor had led me to this moment where I could no longer tell the difference between witness and accomplice. My name is Antonio Tony Aguilar. I'm 43 years old, though some mornings I wake up feeling ancient, like I've lived a dozen lifetimes compressed into the years since I first raised my right hand and swore an oath to defend the Constitution. I served 22 years with the United States Army Special Forces, the Green Berets, and I've seen combat in Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria, and places I still can't name in official reports. I earned my tab and fought alongside some of the finest soldiers this country has ever produced. I believed with the kind of certainty that only the young or the naive possess, that we were the good guys. Gaza was supposed to be different. I was there as a military advisor, part of a small contingent working with Israeli Defense Forces in late 2023 and into 2024, helping coordinate what they called security operations and what I would come to understand as something far darker. The assignment came through channels I'd worked with before, and I accepted it the way I'd accepted every mission for 2 decades, with professional detachment and an assumption that American involvement meant adherence to the laws of war, to the rules of engagement we'd drilled into our bones until they became reflex. I arrived in October, just after the initial strikes. The city was already fractured, its skyline punctured with the gaps where buildings had stood days before. The smell hit me first, that particular combination of pulverized concrete, burning plastic, and death that every combat veteran knows, but can never quite describe to civilians. It's the smell of modern war, of cities being unmade. They briefed us in a compound north of the Strip, in one of those generic military facilities that could have been anywhere in the Middle East, concrete walls, sandbags, the low hum of generators keeping computers and air conditioning running against the desert heat. Lieutenant Colonel Josef Brenner led the briefing, a career officer with gray threading through his temples and eyes that had seen too many operations to show much emotion anymore. He spoke matter-of-factly about targets and threats, about Hamas infrastructure embedded in civilian areas, about the operational necessity of aggressive action. The enemy uses human shields, he said, clicking through slides showing buildings marked in red. They understand that Western sensibilities create tactical advantages. We cannot afford such sentimentality. I'd heard similar reasoning before, in Fallujah, in Kandahar, but there was something in how he said it, a dismissiveness that made me shift in my seat. Beside me, Captain Sarah Chen, an intelligence officer from Fort Bragg, kept her face neutral, but I saw her grip tighten on her pen. The operations began immediately. I was embedded with an IDF unit conducting what they termed clearing operations in the northern neighborhoods. My role was officially observational, assess their tactics, provide recommendations, ensure coordination with American strategic interests. In practice, I was there to give legitimacy, to have an American Green Beret standing beside them as they made decisions about who lived and who died. The first house we entered belonged to the Hassan family. I learned their name later, from the documents we found scattered across the floor after the explosion. At the time, they were just targets, just points on a map marked for clearance. The building was 4 stories, pale yellow concrete like most structures in Gaza, with laundry hanging from one balcony and a child's bicycle chained to the front railing. Intelligence indicates weapons storage. Brenner said through the radio, "Rules of engagement are active. You are cleared hot." We called for the occupants to evacuate. Standard procedure, though the amplified warnings in Arabic echoed through streets that had already been struck 3 times that week. People were learning that leaving meant becoming targets in the open, that staying meant becoming targets in their homes. It was a calculus of survival that had no good answers. They gave them 12 minutes. I watched through binoculars from a position 200 meters away. I saw a man emerge first, hands raised, calling back into the building in what I assumed were reassurances. A woman followed, carrying an infant, two children clutching her dress. An older woman moving slowly. Another man, younger, helping someone who looked injured. 7 individuals exiting, I reported. Mixed ages, include children and elderly, appear to be complying with evacuation order. Confirmed, came the response. Continue observation. The building exploded 6 minutes later, not from our position, but from an airstrike that turned the yellow concrete into a pillar of dust and fire. The blast wave hit us even at that distance, a physical punch that rattled my chest. "Sir, we have civilians clear," I said into the radio, my training keeping my voice level despite the rage building in my throat. Building was evacuated. Why was the strike conducted? The pause lasted long enough that I knew the answer before it came. Secondary intelligence indicated target remained inside. Strike was authorized at highest levels. I looked back at the family huddled in the street, at the children screaming, at the father who had turned back toward the rubble where his home had stood seconds before, at the smoke rising into the pale morning sky. That was the first day. The pattern repeated with variations. Buildings struck with families inside who'd been given no warning at all. Residential blocks leveled because a single suspected militant lived somewhere within them. We adopted a term I'd never heard in Iraq or Afghanistan: power targets. The idea was that massive destruction created deterrence, that showing overwhelming force would break Hamas's will to fight. In practice, it meant that military-age males were presumed combatants, that entire neighborhoods could be designated hostile, that the distinction between civilian and militant became whatever we decided it was in any given moment. I started keeping notes, recording what I saw in a small journal I'd carried through 3 deployments. In Afghanistan, I'd used it to track patterns of insurgent activity. In Gaza, I used it to document what I was increasingly convinced were war crimes. November 3rd, witness strike on apartment complex in Jabalia. Building housed approximately 40 families. Warning given was 5 minutes via roof knock explosive. Observed at least 15 individuals trapped in stairwell when main strike hit. Recovery operations counted 23 dead, including 9 children. Commander justified strike as targeting Hamas command center. No evidence of military activity recovered from rubble. November 8th, a company patrol through Big Hanoun. Unit fired on vehicle attempting to flee checkpoint. Occupants were family of 6 attempting to move south as directed by leaflet drops. All killed. Body of 8-year-old girl showed 3 entry wounds from small arms fire. Incident not reported as civilian casualty. Listed as combatants attempting to breach security perimeter. November 15th. Observed systematic destruction of agricultural infrastructure. Greenhouses, wells and livestock facilities targeted despite no apparent military purpose. When questioned, unit commander stated goal was to make area uninhabitable for enemy forces. Pointed out that enemy forces and civilian population are occupying same areas. Commander responded that this was unfortunate, but operationally necessary. Sarah Chen started noticing the same patterns. We talk in the brief moments between operations, sharing observations in careful language, both of us aware that we were walking a line between duty and conscience. She'd been in military intelligence for 12 years, had worked counterterrorism operations across 3 continents, and she'd never seen anything like what we were witnessing. The proportionality isn't there, she said one evening as we reviewed targeting data. Look at these coordinates. This is a mosque, Tony, used for worship services, community gatherings. They're saying it's a weapons depot, but the intelligence is based on a single source, whose reliability is rated as doubtful. And they're going to level it. Can we push back? I asked, though I already knew the answer. I tried. Got told that Israeli command has operational authority and our role is advisory only. When I pressed, I was reminded that we're here to support our ally, not second-guess their military decisions. The mosque was destroyed that night. 37 people died, including the imam and his family who lived in an adjacent building. Among the rubble, Our recovery teams found prayer rugs, copies of the Quran and children's shoes. No weapons, no ammunition, no evidence of military use. The report we filed was classified and sanitized. Strike on identified military target resulted in collateral damage. Assessment continues. I started taking photographs. Not officially, that would have been a violation of operational security protocols. But with a small camera, I kept in my vest pocket images of destruction that served no military purpose, of bodies that couldn't be explained away as combat, of families torn apart by decisions made in air-conditioned offices, far from the smell of death. In my second month, we were assigned to accompany a unit securing the Al-Shifa hospital complex. The operation was premised on intelligence indicating that Hamas had built command bunkers beneath the hospital, that the facility was being used as a shield for military operations. I'd seen hospitals used that way in Mosul, had witnessed the terrible calculus of fighting an enemy that embedded itself within protected sites. But Al-Shifa was different. We arrived at dawn, surrounding the complex with armor and infantry. Patients and staff were ordered to evacuate, but the hospital was treating thousands of people injured in previous strikes. Mothers in labor, premature infants in incubators, elderly patients on ventilators who couldn't be moved without risking their lives. "You have 4 hours," came the announcement. "All persons must evacuate. Anyone remaining will be considered hostile." I stood in the hospital courtyard, watching nurses try to organize the evacuation, watching doctors frantically working to stabilize patients, enough to be moved, watching security personnel going room to room trying to coordinate the impossible task of moving a functioning hospital in 4 hours. Dr. Khalil Mazawi found me near the entrance. He was maybe 60, with gray hair and glasses that sat crooked on his face, wearing scrubs that were stained with blood and other fluids. He spoke perfect English with a British accent, trained in London. He told me later, "Please," he said, his voice steady despite the desperation in his eyes. "We have 31 patients who cannot be moved, premature infants, critical care cases. Moving them means death. Give us more time or allow us to keep minimal staff." I radioed the request up the chain. The response was immediate and inflexible. 4 hours, no exceptions. Anyone remaining is considered hostile. These are doctors and patients. I replied, protected under Geneva Convention. We cannot treat medical facilities as legitimate military targets without clear evidence of military use. Evidence is classified and sufficient. 4 hours, Dr. Mazavi heard enough of the response through my radio to understand. He looked at me for a long moment, and in his eyes I saw something I'd been avoiding, the recognition that I was complicit, that my presence here, my American uniform, my Special Forces insignia, all of it was being used to legitimize what was happening. "You're the good guys," he said quietly. "That's what we always heard. America has rules. America follows the laws of war. America would never allow this." He gestured around the courtyard, at the chaos, at the injured being loaded onto makeshift gurneys. "Where are your rules now, soldier?" I had no answer. They stormed the hospital at hour 4 and 13 minutes. I watched from an observation post as infantry cleared floor by floor, as they dragged out the remaining doctors and nurses, as they removed the 31 patients who couldn't be moved. 17 died within 6 hours. 8 more died in the following days from complications of premature removal from life support. The tunnels they found beneath the hospital were real, a network of corridors and rooms that Hamas had indeed constructed, but they were smaller than described, less sophisticated than the intelligence briefing suggested, and most importantly, they'd been abandoned. No command center, no weapons caches beyond a few small arms. Nothing that justified what had been done. The photographs released to the press showed soldiers discovering the tunnels, vindication for the operation. They didn't show the incubators that had been shut down, the dialysis patients who died, the mothers who delivered babies in the street because they'd been forced to evacuate mid-labor. I submitted a report. Sarah submitted a report. We detailed the discrepancies between intelligence and reality, between justification and result. We cited specific violations of international humanitarian law. Failure to provide adequate time for evacuation. Targeting of protected medical facilities without proportional military necessity. Treatment of medical staff as combatant. The response came from a colonel, whose name I won't include here because he's still serving. Your observations are noted. However, operational command lies with Israeli forces. Our role is support and advisory. You are not authorized to make determinations regarding compliance with international law. Continue mission. That's when I understood that they didn't care. That the reports were for documentation, for legal cover, for the eventual whitewashing of history. That my presence wasn't about ensuring compliance with American values or laws of war. I was there to provide the appearance of oversight. The suggestion that grown-ups were in the room while children died in rubble and doctors were treated as terrorists. December brought a grinding intensification. The operation expanded south, into areas where refugees from the north had been told to evacuate. Families who'd fled once were bombed again in their new location. The phrase safe zones became a bitter joke. There was nowhere safe, just areas that hadn't been struck yet. I was assigned to a targeting cell reviewing strike requests. Each day we'd sit in a room with screens showing drone footage, with intelligence summaries that were often little more than pattern-of-life analysis, military-age males congregating, therefore presumptive militants, structures in known Hamas-controlled areas, therefore legitimate targets, vehicles moving at night, therefore enemy logistics. The threshold for civilian casualties was explicit. Any strike could be authorized if the military value outweighed anticipated civilian deaths. But the calculation of military value was so broad, and the counting of anticipated civilian deaths so narrow, that almost nothing was rejected. "Sir, this building houses 12 families," I said during one targeting review, pointing to a residential block marked for destruction. "Intelligence indicates one suspected Hamas member lives somewhere in the structure. Unknown which unit. We're talking potential 60 to 80 civilians at risk for one maybe target." The Israeli targeting officer, a major I'd worked with for weeks, didn't even look up from his screen. The individual is senior leadership. High-value target. Families were warned to leave the area. Those who remain accept the risk. Strike approved. With respect, sir. A generalized warning to leave an area isn't the same as specific warning for an imminent strike. International law requires, Captain Aguilar, the major interrupted, finally meeting my eyes. International law is written by people who've never fought an enemy that hides behind children. We're fighting for survival. Every day we hesitate. Our people die. If you cannot support this mission, perhaps you should request reassignment. I should have requested reassignment. I should have refused to continue participating in operations that violated every principle of warfare I'd been taught at Fort Benning and Fort Bragg, that contradicted the laws of armed conflict drilled into every American soldier. But I told myself that leaving would accomplish nothing, that at least while I was present I could continue documenting, could push back in small ways, could bear witness. The truth is, I was afraid. Afraid of the consequences of refusal, of being labeled someone who didn't support our allies, of derailing a career I'd built over 2 decades. I told myself I was staying for the right reasons, but I was staying because leaving required a courage I wasn't sure I possessed. Sarah Chen made a different choice. In mid-December, she submitted a formal report through the chain of command, detailing specific incidents that she assessed as violations of international humanitarian law. She requested an investigation and stated that she could no longer in good conscience participate in operations that in her assessment constituted war crimes. They sent her home within 48 hours. Not dishonorably, they were too smart for that, but reassigned to a desk job at Fort Belvoir, where her expertise in Middle Eastern operations would be wasted on administrative work. The message was clear to everyone who remained. Documentation was fine, even expected, but don't make waves. I stayed. God help me, I stayed. January 2024 was when I witnessed the incident that finally broke me. We were operating in Khan Yunis in the south, where hundreds of thousands of refugees had crowded into schools and hospitals and any structure still standing. The density was unlike anything I'd seen outside of refugee camps, multiple families per room, people sleeping in hallways and courtyards, medical supplies exhausted, and food scarce. Our unit was tasked with clearing a neighborhood adjacent to a UN school compound. Intelligence. Always intelligence. Always assessments from sources we couldn't verify indicated tunnel entrances beneath residential buildings. The operation was to be surgical, identify specific structures, clear them, demolish tunnel access points, but surgical operations don't exist in neighborhoods where every building shares walls with 3 others, where families are packed so tight that a single explosion cascades through entire blocks. The first strike went exactly as briefed. Building demolished, tunnel entrance confirmed. No casualties in the immediate structure because we'd managed to evacuate it. But the blast brought down 2 adjacent buildings, both packed with refugees who'd fled from the north. The collapse happened so fast that there was no time to react, just a roar and a wall of dust and then screaming. We spent 6 hours pulling bodies from the rubble. I carried out 23 myself, counting each one, memorizing faces even though I knew the memory would haunt me. 16 were children. The youngest was maybe 2 years old, a boy in a red shirt, covered in gray dust except where blood had made tracks down his face. His name was Omar. I learned that from his mother, who we pulled out alive but crushed from the waist down. She kept calling his name, kept asking if we'd found him, kept begging me in broken English to find her baby. I lied to her, told her we were still searching, because I couldn't make myself say that I'd already pulled her child's body from the rubble, that his skull had been crushed by concrete, that there was nothing left to search for except a corpse. She died before they could get her to a hospital. Died, calling for her son. Died in the dust of Gaza because we'd made a decision that military necessity outweighed the risk to refugees in a UN compound. The official report listed them as regrettable civilian casualties resulting from necessary military operation against terrorist infrastructure. 23 people reduced to a footnote in a targeting assessment. Omar and his mother became numbers in a spreadsheet tracking collateral damage ratios. I sat in my quarters that night and finally let myself acknowledge what I'd been avoiding for months. I was participating in war crime. Not incidentally, not as occasional aberrations in an otherwise lawful operation, but as systematic policy. The pattern was clear: disproportionate force, inadequate distinction between civilians and combatants, collective punishment of civilian populations, targeting of protected sites without military necessity. Everything I documented added up to a portrait of systematic violations of the laws of war. And I was there, in my American uniform with my Special Forces tab, providing the legitimacy of U.S. military presence while it happened. I thought about the oath I'd sworn 22 years earlier. I will support and defend the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic. I'd always focused on the enemy's part, on the fighting, on being the tip of the spear, but I'd never really considered the support and defend the Constitution part. Never thought deeply about what that meant beyond simple patriotism. The Constitution wasn't just a piece of paper with rules, it was a set of values, of principles about human dignity and the rule of law. The United States had signed the Geneva Conventions, had helped write the international laws of armed conflict, had prosecuted Nazis and Japanese war criminals for the same kinds of systematic targeting of civilians I was witnessing. If supporting and defending the Constitution meant anything, it meant refusing to participate in violations of the laws my country had committed to uphold. I started preparing my own report, not the sanitized operational summaries we filed daily, but a comprehensive documentation of what I'd witnessed. I included dates, locations, casualty counts, names where I knew them. I included photographs, careful to redact anything that could compromise operational security, but showing enough to demonstrate the systematic nature of what was occurring. I cited specific articles of the Geneva Conventions. Article 48 requiring distinction between civilians and combatants. Article 51 prohibiting indiscriminate attacks. Article 57 requiring precautions in attack, including adequate warning. I documented how each of these principles had been violated repeatedly, systematically. The hardest part was writing about my own complicity, about the times I'd remained silent when I should have spoken, about the operations I'd supported despite my misgivings, about the ways I'd rationalized and justified and told myself I was doing what I could when I knew I could have done more. I wrote, "For 22 years I believed that wearing this uniform meant standing for something larger than myself, for principles that distinguished us from our enemies. I believed that American soldiers were held to a higher standard, that we followed the laws of war even when it was difficult, especially when it was difficult, because that's what separated us from terrorists and Gaza. I have learned that these beliefs were naive. I have witnessed American military personnel provide support and legitimacy to operations that systematically violate international humanitarian law. I have watched as civilian casualties were dismissed as unavoidable, as entire neighborhoods were destroyed for marginal military advantage, as protected sites including hospitals and schools were targeted without adequate justification. I have participated in these operations. I have provided targeting advice that led to civilian deaths. I have remained silent when I should have objected. I have filed reports that sanitized and justified actions that I knew were wrong. I can no longer do this. I can no longer wear this uniform while participating in operations that violate the laws my country claims to uphold. I can no longer be silent while children die in rubble, and mothers scream for their babies and doctors are treated as terrorists for trying to save lives." This report documents systematic violations of international humanitarian law. It is my assessment that the operations I have witnessed in Gaza constitute war crimes under the definitions provided in the Geneva Conventions and customary international law. It is my further assessment that American military personnel providing support to these operations are complicit in these violations. I am requesting immediate reassignment and an investigation into the operations described in this report. I am prepared to testify before any appropriate authority regarding what I have witnessed. I can no longer follow orders that I believe to be unlawful. I submitted the report through official channels on January. I also sent copies to my Congresswoman, to the Inspector General, to the International Committee of the Red Cross. I knew that sending it outside the chain of command was career suicide, but I'd already decided that my career was over the moment I decided to tell the truth. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Within 6 hours I was relieved of duties and confined to quarters pending investigation. Within 24 hours my security clearance was suspended. Within a week I was on a flight back to the States, escorted by 2 MPs as if I were a criminal rather than a soldier who'd served honorably for 2 decades. They never investigated the allegations in my report. Instead, they investigated me. They accused me of unauthorized disclosure of classified information, of violating operational security, of prejudicing good order and discipline. They leaked to friendly media that I was unstable, that I'd suffered a breakdown, that my allegations were the result of PTSD and couldn't be trusted. Some of that was probably true. I was unstable, in the sense that I was having nightmares about children in rubble, that I couldn't close my eyes without seeing Omar's crushed skull, that I'd wake up screaming because I could still hear his mother calling his name. If that's what they meant by unstable, then guilty as charged. But PTSD doesn't make you see things that aren't there. It makes you unable to unsee things that are, and what I saw was real. The photographs I'd taken were confiscated. The journals I'd kept were classified. The other soldiers who'd witnessed the same things I had were warned that discussing operations with unauthorized personnel could result in prosecution. They built a wall of classification and operational security around the truth, and they painted me as someone who'd violated that security rather than exposed crimes. I was offered a deal: retire quietly with full benefits, sign an NDA about classified operations, make no further statements about what I'd witnessed, and they'd drop all charges. The alternative was court-martial, possible conviction, prison time, dishonorable discharge, loss of all benefits. I took the deal. I'm not proud of it, but I took it because I was exhausted and broken and I didn't have the strength left to fight. They let me retire as a decorated combat veteran, let me keep my pension and benefits, let me walk away from 22 years of service with my honor technically intact. But I know the truth. I know I compromised. I know that in exchange for my silence and my security, I agreed to let them bury what I'd witnessed. I know that children are still dying in Gaza while I sit here in safety, bound by an agreement that prevents me from speaking publicly about what I saw. This memoir is my attempt to live with that compromise, to find some way to bear witness even within the constraints I've accepted. I can't discuss specific classified operations or intelligence. I can't name certain individuals or locations, but I can tell my story, can describe in general terms what I witnessed, can try to convey the human cost of decisions made far from the battlefield. I'm back in the States now, living in a small town where nobody knows I'm a veteran unless I tell them. I'm in therapy, working through the nightmares and the guilt. Some days are better than others. Some days I can almost convince myself that I did what I could, that staying as long as I did was itself a form of resistance, that my report and documentation might eventually matter. Other days I wake up thinking about Omar, about his mother, about Dr. Mazawi, and all the other doctors trying to save lives while bombs fell on hospitals, about the Hassan family and their yellow house and the laundry that was still hanging on the balcony when we turned their home into rubble. I think about the oath I swore: support and defend the Constitution against all enemies, foreign and domestic. I think about how sometimes the enemy isn't foreign, isn't a terrorist in the hills or an insurgent in the streets, but is the comfortable lies we tell ourselves about who we are and what we're willing to accept. For 22 years I was a Green Beret. I was part of the most elite fighting force on earth, trained to operate in hostile territory, to win against overwhelming odds, to never quit and never accept defeat. I was proud of that identity, proud of the tab on my shoulder and the regiment I served with. But in Gaza, I learned that all that training, all that tradition, all that pride meant nothing if I wasn't willing to stand up when it mattered most. I learned that following orders isn't the same as doing what's right, that supporting our allies doesn't mean supporting their crimes, that sometimes the most courageous act a soldier can perform is to refuse. I learned it too late to save Omar or his mother or the thousands of others who died while I watched and documented and told myself I was doing what I could. But maybe not too late to say this. To any soldier reading this, who finds themselves in a similar position, who is witnessing things that contradict everything you were taught about the laws of war and American values, you have a choice. It's not an easy choice, and it will cost you, but you have one. You can follow orders and live with the consequences, or you can refuse and live with different consequences. Neither option is without cost, but I'll tell you what has cost me more than anything: the knowledge that I could have done more, that I compromised when I should have stood firm, that I accepted restrictions on my truth-telling in exchange for my comfort and security. If I could go back, I would refuse the deal. I would testify publicly, accept the court-martial, go to prison if necessary. I would do that because some truths are more important than one soldier's career or comfort or pension. Some truths need to be told even when, especially when powerful institutions want them buried. The truth about Gaza is that I witnessed systematic violations of international humanitarian law. The truth is that American military personnel provided support and legitimacy to operations that killed thousands of civilians, that destroyed hospitals and schools and homes, that treated entire populations as acceptable collateral damage in pursuit of military objectives. The truth is that children died in rubble while I watched, that mothers screamed for babies who would never answer, that doctors were treated as terrorists for trying to save lives, that everything I'd been taught about American values and the laws of war meant nothing when weighed against political expedience and alliance politics. The truth is that I'm complicit, that I participated, that I supported, that I didn't do enough to stop it, that when it mattered most, I chose my career and my security over the lives of people whose names I'll never know but whose faces I'll see until the day I die. This memoir can't change what happened. It can't bring back Omar or his mother or any of the thousands who died. It can't undo the destruction or heal the wounds or make right what was made wrong. But it can bear witness. It can stand as testimony that someone saw, that someone cared, that someone was there and understood that what was happening was wrong. It can serve as a warning to future soldiers that following orders isn't enough, that wearing the uniform comes with a responsibility to uphold the principles that uniform is supposed to represent. Most of all, it can be my attempt at redemption, not forgiveness. I don't deserve that and wouldn't accept it if offered, but perhaps a small measure of atonement, a way of saying to all those I failed, I saw you, I remember you, your deaths mattered. Even if they were reduced to footnotes in classified reports, your lives had value, even if that value wasn't recognized by the people who made decisions about acceptable collateral damage. The child's shoe I saw that first day is still there, in my memory, lying in the rubble with its strap torn and its cartoon characters faded by dust. I don't know whose it was, don't know if the child who wore it survived or died, don't know if they think about that shoe the way I do. But I remember it. I remember all of it. And now, within the constraints I've accepted and with all the limitations those constraints impose, I've told as much as I'm able to tell. It's not enough. It will never be enough. But it's what I have to offer. The testimony of one soldier who went to Gaza believing in American values and came back understanding how easily those values can be betrayed, how quickly honor can become complicity, how thin the line is between witness and accomplice. I'm 43 years old, and I feel ancient. I've lived a dozen lifetimes in the years since I first raised my right hand and swore an oath to defend the Constitution. I earned my tab and served with honor for 22 years. And in Gaza I learned that honor without courage is worthless, that service without conscience is complicity, that wearing the uniform means nothing if you're not willing to stand up when the moment demands it. This is my testimony. This is my truth, as much of it as I'm able to tell. May God forgive me for all the rest. And Tony Aguilar served 22 years in the United States Army Special Forces before retiring, and he now lives in the American Southwest, where he works with veterans organizations and continues his advocacy for accountability in military operations. The events described in this memoir represent his personal experiences and observations. Names and certain identifying details have been changed to protect individuals and comply with security agreements.